Welcome to Human Potential at Work, the show where we explore social impact, inclusion, and empowerment of everyone, including persons with disabilities. Get ready to be inspired, hear success stories, and learn tips and principles for bringing out the best in everyone.
Hello, everyone. This is Debra Rue, and this is Human Potential at Work. I do want to say, because it's probably noticeable, that I have definitely gone silver all the way, but I decided to add some fun little lilac highlights too. So my guest today is Peter Fremlin, and he's like, Deborah, I don't have enough color on, so I'm looking boring. So he's going to go and get a beautiful scarf. No, but welcome to Access Chat, Peter. Geez. Um, Sorry, this is a Human Potential at Work, and that's funny. Obviously, had a little brain freeze there, but anyway, Peter, I've known you for many years, and I've always been a big fan of your work, and I have watched you grow in your work. And so I know that when we first met, I believe you were working in Bangladesh, and now you're working in and joining us from Cairo, Egypt today. And I'm just really excited about this conversation because you are a mentor to me. I've learned a lot from you, and I really have enjoyed working with you, especially working with you with the International Labor Organization's Global Business Disability Network. So welcome to the program.
Thank you, Debra. It's such a pleasure to be here. And I've always taken a lot of encouragement and support from you. So thank you for this chance to talk about things today.
Yes. So Peter, tell the audience a little bit about who you are and your journey.
Debra. As you were saying, my journey has some interesting places along the way. It started off in the UK. I'm British. My mum's Portuguese, but I grew up pretty much in the UK. After I graduated, I started moving abroad. I studied my master's degree in Brazil, and that's where I started looking at disability issues. I was doing social anthropology, and I did research with people with physical disabilities there. And then since then, I've become mostly an independent consultant working in international development. And I've carried on the journey. I really try and combine my work with really getting immersed in the places that I lived. So I was working and living in Bangladesh for over 4 years. I think we saw each other when I went through Geneva briefly. And now I'm in Cairo where I'm studying Arabic. So I work on disability issues in international development mostly. A lot of my work is on employment, and you mentioned the International Labor Organization, which is the UN agency specialized on work issues. And I do a lot of work with them and their disability team and other things along the way to help people working in international cooperation to see disability as an issue and to try and bring it more on board. And just to add that, so about me personally, I love learning languages, as I was saying, and I'm also a person with disability myself, and we can talk about that as well.
Yes, and I look forward to talking about that. I know a lot about your work, and I know that you are you're very you don't brag a lot about your work, and so I've always admired your work, and so I'm going to have to brag about it for you. But I was getting prepared for the interview. And sometimes when I know someone real well, like I've known you for years, I still really take the time to dig in because there's probably things that I've missed. And I found that to be definitely true with you. And you wrote an article that I thought was so interesting, and you were still in Bangladesh when you wrote it. But the title of the article is Disability is Part of Who I Am and Why I'm Great at My Job. And you had mentioned before we went on air that they encouraged you just to, say I'm great at my job. And you're like, no, I want to say all of it. And so I just think that's a very, and I personally think you are great at your job. I've seen you at the ILO. I'm sorry, but I've seen the work that you're doing, and it's some of the best in the world. So I'm sorry that I'm embarrassing you, but it's just true. Sorry. So I I see the efforts that you're making, and it's interesting with the International Labor Organization, because I've talked to Stefan Trammell. We've had him on the show, and he's brilliant, and his colleague Jürgen, and we've just talked about all of the issues that the ILO is working on. For example, like future of work and youth and employment, and in the broadest sense of the word, they are dealing with labor for the United Nations, and so for the world, and certainly for the developing countries. And making sure that disability is part of that agenda is a lot harder than we would realize, because there's so many moving parts with an organization this big. And so I was hoping that you might just address a little bit of how you and the GBDN and other efforts that you've made, including the group that we're both part of that you started, maybe just talk about, how do we make sure disability continues to be meaningfully included?
Thank you, Deborah. Thank you for embarrassing me. I think maybe I'll sort of start my answer with a kind of bit of that personal take, and why I wrote sort of something that sort of linked my disability with how I work, because it's something like we often don't really expect, right? And I think I grew up having a disability, and I think I kind of had in this idea, like my family really liked traveling, but I had in this idea, well, I wouldn't really be able to travel so much independently. I would kind of need a job that I'm kind of in an office, have a bit of a mobility issue, and we were looking in those terms. And then that really changed when I got connected to the disability movement internationally. It was actually first when I was in Bangladesh, when I was a student, and it was quite by chance I met a small organization of disabled people. And that really sort of motivated me, and was the first time that I'd, as a disabled person, connected to other disabled people. So I think that was kind of the first thing it brings to my work. It brought me a mission and a goal and something to contribute to, and it made me part of an international community, right? So rather than, like, often disability can separate you or sort of push you out, but in this case, it's now something that I can connect, and I think you've also connected all over the world in terms of disability. It's something that offers a huge potential. And then that sort of on the individualist basis as well, I think sort of the ways I approach my work, the ways I sort of really give emphasis to language learning, that isn't something a lot of my colleagues do. And my disability is definitely connected with that. It's not the only reason, but it would be very hard for me to live in Egypt or Bangladesh or wherever without speaking the language, because I kind of need to explain to people, like, just at random, that I might need a little adjustment, I might need a little bit of help or whatever. Like I couldn't, these are countries that sort of, maybe especially Bangladesh, there's lots of really big problems around physical accessibility of infrastructure. But if you've got a bit of chat, then like people are really going to get involved in helping you. And so that's something that a lot of my colleagues in the sector don't have. So that's another thing. And this kind of this is the vision that then maybe we work on when we're looking at the world of work, that disability can be a positive thing and it can be a contribution. That normally when we raise disability, or you might hire a disabled person, we get really creative at looking for what problems they're going to have, right? We get really creative about sort of demanding, we really need to know they can do this. We need to know it's going to be safe. We need to know they're going to be productive. We need to know X, Y. We need a guarantee that this is going to be okay because we're a bit scared of this. Guarantees that you wouldn't ask about hiring anyone else, that you just do after an interview, check a reference and looks right, like looks a bit like us, like let's do it. But for disabled people, like those kind of problematic questions come up a lot more easily when we could be looking at those kind of questions of contribution and how sort of, say, working around someone's disability might help improve your workflow, might help you connect with a client, might help you make a different product. And so we're sort of in what I support the ILO and the Global Business Disability Network in kind of making technical products, thinking about how we can think through employment and issues around disability. And it's really trying to emphasize to people those kind of contributions. And like, so part of that is the journey that you're involved in as well, which is just changing the way people talk and think about disability. And as you've seen, and as you know, that's kind of this journey that I went through in my life and still going through. And sort of in my personal relationship with work, but also what we're trying to sort of change in the world of work for other people as well.
Yes, and the ILO GBDN's work is very important, and I want to, I want to explore that more. But when I was reading the article that you wrote, this particular one about I have a disability, but I'm great at my job, you had mentioned that in this particular job you were working in Bangladesh, you were on the ground floor, and your team was actually on the third floor, but they didn't have a lift. And, you think, oh, it's Bangladesh, they're still working on their infrastructure. They're a developing country. And yet we see this happening all over the world continually, constantly. And we also see often that there are employers that are nervous about hiring somebody that with mobility issues that maybe uses a wheelchair or a scooter, because especially in the US, they get nervous about it because they know that legally that they are supposed to have an accessible workforce. Legally, they're supposed to do it. I mean, our Americans with Disabilities Act was created in 1990. And then, of course, you have been very engaged, as so have I, in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the CRPD. So it's interesting. And what we don't want is we don't want employers to be afraid to include people with disabilities because maybe they'll get in trouble because, they'll be sued in the US or something like that. But there's very creative ways that you can include people with disabilities, like some of the work that you've done and some of the personal experiences you've had. And I was hoping you would comment a little bit on that.
No, those are things. Thanks for bringing out those issues, because I think there's something like I mentioned that in the article because I've been thinking like, well, what is the link between disability and my career? And I was thinking like sometimes when I was seeing the situation of disabled people in Bangladesh, I was thinking, well, I'm not that disabled, am I? Like, because people with sort of often maybe their mobility problem was a bit less, but their disability in terms of their social barriers was a lot more, right? There were people that sort of friends of mine that had to leave school because they were getting bullied about their disability. Some people couldn't go to school. Some people that had been kind of essentially hidden by their families, or people having real difficulties finding work and a way to use those skills. And then, so in that context, I was thinking, well, sort of maybe it's not so much after all, because I didn't have barriers to education. I didn't have barriers to finding my first work, and that comes from this kind of previous generation that really sort of fought for those things. And then I realized after a few days of thinking, like, wait a minute, like I am not sitting on the same floor as my team, like, and so that was really interesting to me, that I'd kind of like really, it was much easier for me to see my own life as not experiencing discrimination, even though like I'm a disabled person working with disability issues, and you'd think that would be quite sort of clear in my mind. It was easier to not look at that. And the other side of this that I want to bring out is that I've been quite like, it's sad to say, but I have to say that I've been lucky. And I'm going to say that I'm lucky because I see lots of people with disabilities that don't have the same luck, right? And I'll talk about where the luck comes from. But I've, like the first job I had, our program manager said, any adaptation you need, we'll give it to you, right? This next job that I had with the ILO, well, the office was like not very accessible to me, but rather than saying you can't work here, they said, oh, look, we'll find a place for you on the ground floor. I didn't have a telephone, so that was a bit awkward. But then they put in a telephone for me. I had to sort of complain about that, and etc. And sort of other positions I've had sort of had what we call kind of reasonable accommodations, these adjustments that you make for individual needs. But let's look at that luck, right? I got that luck because like in that situation in Bangladesh, I was a foreigner and quite sort of high status, and I've got a bit of a fancy education and whatnot, and all this kind of fanciness that I brought meant that I got access to those things, whereas sort of maybe Bangladeshi colleagues wouldn't have gotten access to those things, like sort of, and it's not to name and shame organizations, but I think we just need to be realistic that one of the reasons that you can get adaptations is when sort of, if you're doing a certain type of job, it's much easier and you have much more sort of status that it's going to be given to you. And unfortunately, that isn't a general rule for everyone. One example that I find really telling, working in different parts of the United Nations and different agencies within the United Nations around the world, a lot of the offices are inaccessible. And if even I, or even colleagues that are staff with disabilities that are getting all the status and the official positions, if even we feel it's inaccessible, and even if we feel it's difficult, imagine like for the people that aren't part of that system, that are kind of outside of the UN and whatnot. So that's it's changing, I hope, but that was the kind of that's the reflection that I'd like to bring, that these adaptations can really help work happen. For some people, they're given to on a quite natural basis, but like what we're trying to do is that these same adaptations that are so obvious in some cases, then that like obviousness is spread out and applied more widely.
I think that some of the things, I think there's so many interesting things that you just said. And I find the word luck interesting. And because I can see it. So you're in Bangladesh, you're a well-educated man, you're very smart, you have a lot to offer. You also have this lovely British accent. And so there are all of these factors, right? And so it's fascinating. So, and also, Peter, I think some of it is the way you speak and the way you interact with people. You have always been very gracious when you've interacted with me and others, and you're very humble, and you have a very, very, very nice energy about you. And I think that's some of it, but I shouldn't have to have a cool accent and be well educated. I should be able to be included, because we should be including people, which you're making those points. But at the same time, I think that it is a very interesting, dynamic that you bring up. And I know in the articles that I was reading, you were talking about continuing to remind people, and this is something I more and more want to talk about, especially from the U.S. lens, in that you continue to remind people that all disabilities are not visible. So yes, you use a scooter, and so wheelchair scooter, and so people know when they meet you that you have a disability, because there is some cue, assuming they can see. They wouldn't know you had a disability if they couldn't see. But we have to remember, many people have disabilities that are not visible. And I know you talk a lot about that, but one thing that I'm starting to ponder and really think about in my head, and I'm going to write about this, but we're talking about a lot on my team, Rue Global Impact, but I have a couple of employees I have a team, obviously, but there's two employees that work for me that would be considered severely disabled. I have this terrific woman that has been on the show. Her name is, well, both of these people have been on the show, but Rosemary Musashia, who is our Chief Accessibility Officer. And Rosemary, as she was being born, the doctor dropped her and she sustained very bad injuries, and she was diagnosed with cerebral palsy. And Rosemary, when she lies down flat, all she has the ability to control is blinking her eyes. And she told me that one time. But she uses technology as her voice, and she uses technology to be on the computer, and she has so much to offer the world. And I'm just so blessed that I've gotten to work with this woman. And then there's another gentleman, Lamondre Pugh, who worked with me. Both Rosemary and Lamondre actually worked with me in my former company, Tech Access, and then they both joined me at Rue Global Communications. But Lamondre is also this amazing man that has so many talents, but he is a man that's in a wheelchair. He has limited use of his arms and his legs. And he, and so the thing that's very sad to me is when Lamondre left my former company, Tech Access, and went out on his own and everything, he really struggled. And so one thing that I'm starting to see is that we are hiring people with disabilities all over the world, but just looking at for a moment for the US lens, we're hiring people with disabilities, but it still feels like we're taking the easy hires, right? So, no, we're hiring people with disabilities. I mean, Deborah, you have depression and ADHD, so you're a great hire. Boom, done, check mark. Yay. And then we have really talented people like Lamondre and Rosemary, that because of the severity of their disabilities, employers are just terrified of them, and they will not even give them a chance. And I wonder sometimes, and I understand why the United Nations did this and why the national laws did this, but as we were putting all the disability groups together, mental health, cognitive, physical, blind, deaf, blah, that it the people with very severe disabilities like a Lamondre or Rosemary, they're not being included. Except, I mean, they are, because I'm an employer, and I win because I have just these two amazing examples of staff. But I worry about this. This is what I worry about, Peter. So how are we going to solve this, and how's this causing
Wow.
problems all over the world? I know it's interesting, isn't it? I know you.
Thank you. Thank you, Deborah. I really love that. Those kind of experiences that you share, because I think sort of that also shows part of the answer, that we can't sort of rule out the participation of people with severe disabilities too soon. But to kind of go back a few steps, I think, like you started off by saying about the visible or invisible disabilities. I don't really like that kind of like it's an easy shorthand. I don't think it sort of ends up being like such a helpful way to think about it always. Like because it's always sort of quite hard to tell what is visible and what isn't. But like the first thing to say is that then there are a lot more people with disabilities than we might expect, and they're in situations that we wouldn't have anticipated. So this article you're mentioning was a response to someone saying there aren't disabled people working in international development, and I was like, hang on, there are. I'm one. And another interesting thing about that is like, well, then I know other people that are people with disabilities, but they're not going to talk about it. Because like they're worried about what their employer is going to say, so they don't mind telling me or you, but they're not going to raise that because it doesn't feel it doesn't feel safe. So I think like that's one of the things that we need to kind of like adjust in our mindset, that people with disabilities have always been everywhere. They've always been in every group. There are lots of really famous people that have had disabilities, but then we kind of maybe promote them in some of the same way that maybe I was promoted in Bangladesh. We don't think of someone like FDR as a person with disability, right? That he is totally a person with disability, but that you might study history about him and not mention that, or kind of someone like Frida Kahlo. You might that you see from her work, but that isn't one of the things mentioned about her. And it's something, it's interesting, a lot of the times when I'm introduced, people don't mention that I have a disability, right? But if we talk about someone that's less well off, we definitely mention it. right, in our work. And so that's a bit of a kind of asymmetry that somehow like often privilege erases things. And maybe that's why it was hard to see that I was getting some discrimination, even though I was in a privileged position. But that's the kind of first thing. There's more disability than expect. Kind of second thing, I really liked fact you bring up that when we talk about disability, we're talking about so many types and situations. Often people sort of say to me, well, you should like work on more than just physical disability, right? And I'm like, what do you think I'm doing? But then I realized that's kind of my fault, that we're using a label that I think you and I see as a really big term that covers sort of 15 or 20% of populations and is really inclusive and is a point of pride and something that can bring us together and something that describes like a natural part of the human condition that sort of sooner or later we're all going to be sort of something or other in it. But most people, when they hear disability, that isn't what they think. And a lot of groups might push back against it. They're like, sort of what I'm experiencing is, say, old age. It's not disability. What I'm experiencing is a mental health condition. It's not a disability. And we're like, hang on. Like we're using disability in a good way, right? Like we're using disability in this big umbrella to bring people together. And that was like, that's the foundation of these legislations and frameworks on disability. But then, like, I really love your question because it kind of calls us to account, like that is our work on disability then, like you say, just going for the easy options, or is it kind of reaching people that sort of we most need to kind of adapt society to and make services that reach them and really like it is actually inclusion. And like, unfortunately, my first response is that is totally like a thing that is happening that you're seeing, like the lots of people are going for the easy options. Lots of people are seeing that there's kind of shortcuts to inclusion and that they are like this kind of story about me in the office. You could read both ways. You could read, oh, well, that's a great first step for them. This is kind of growing an inclusion. Or you could say, well, they hired Peter because it's much easier than hiring someone with a different type of disability, wasn't it? And they haven't made the accessibility adjustments that they need to. So like you can read that both ways, and I think it's a journey. I think just to kind of share quite an interesting story about this to show how it's different in different places. In December, I was back in Bangladesh and I was talking with groups of disabled people there, and we're discussing employment. And they also said this thing: companies are just hiring easy options. And then, like, I was like, well, what do you mean by easy options? And they meant sort of really kind of what we would see as quite minimal physical impairments. And for them, one of our colleagues there, and she, Ashrafuddin Mishti, she recently won a prize, actually, her abilities prize. She said she went to Japan. She's a woman. She's in a wheelchair, and she said to the Japanese audience, "I have a severe disability," and they laughed at her because she was a person using a wheelchair, but she could had full use of her arms and whatnot. And so, for what was her kind of a severe disability in the Bangladesh context, was to a Japanese audience like quite an ordinary run-of-the-mill one, right? And that was such an interesting moment for me. And I think that really shows that these social issues are so important to look at in disabilities. That confirms what we knew about that. That made me quite sad for Bangladesh situation, reminding me there that, well, actually, if that is seen as a kind of severe case, that means that we are leaving a lot of people out. And yeah, it gives the idea that maybe that can be changed. I think sort of like, maybe I'm sort of skirting around your questions. I think another way I would skirt around it is by sort of taking one of the conclusions of this, which is like, well, what is severe is really different in different cases. And there's lots of people with quite severe impairments that then have a lot of inclusion, a lot of support for the inclusion, and a lot of people with sort of more basic impairments that then have more exclusion, and vice versa. So sometimes when people raise this issue, or they say, look, we can include people with minor disabilities, but we can't include people with severe ones, I really kind of question what they think about as severe and minor, because they probably, they might say, well, if someone is totally blind, then that's a severe disability, for example. And you're like, well, maybe if you want to label it like that, but also that's something that the right assistive technology you can just sort of get around quite easily. So it's about changing those expectations. And then also some people are going to really need universal design to be put into place, and not just sort of partially accessible things. They're going to really need these assistive services that we talk about, and these adaptations. They're going to really need support from governments and employers and their communities. And I think we really believe that with that support, then the contribution that comes out in various ways, whether it's through work or other ways, or just sort of them being able to live their lives more independently and according to their choices, will be a really great contribution. So I think that's why we do what we do. I don't think I answered your question, but I think I kind of really agree that it's an important one that helps us keep us to account in our work, and we need to keep looking to make sure we are tackling hard situations, if they're hard for whatever reason, maybe the severity of disability, maybe other reasons, maybe intersectionality, association with other sort of social criteria. The thing I've looked at in my work is that interaction between poverty and disability in various countries. We need to be looking at that. I don't think I gave a quick solution.
No, you did. No, the reality is these are hard questions. And to say somebody has a severe disabilities is in the eyes of the beholder, because as you said, you're dealing with somebody that's blind. And but technology can help level the playing field. And so I just think that it's important to talk about it, because I see, and I am so proud to be an American. I'm so proud to be an American. But I see a lot of celebration going on in the United States about, woohoo, we've done so much, when I think that we have so much to do. Now, I believe, obviously, in celebrating every step of the way. Let's celebrate our successes. But I just want to keep reminding employers that we have only begun, and I think we can learn so much by what's already been done. We're doing a better job of including people with autism, starting to do a better job of including people with autism in the workforce, and we can learn so much from those efforts. And so now we need to keep expanding and growing. But I want to be careful that we don't accidentally just always go for the easy, and make sure. And there's so many moving parts with this, why I think that the work you do is so important. And I want you just to talk a little bit about, I want to explore just a little bit about the GBDN and the work you're doing, and these amazing multinational corporations that have stepped up, signed the ILO GBDN charter, and said, no, we're going to make disability inclusion a priority. The ILO GBDN is supporting the Valuable 500 work that Dr. Caroline Casey is involved in. And also, Peter, I want you to talk about the group of disability consultants that you and your colleague, this group that you created, because it's a pretty powerful group, and I always am learning from it. There's so much to know. So
thank you, Deborah. just to maybe, before I get into the work stuff, just to say about that issue of being proud. I'm really proud to be connected to Bangladesh and the connection that I've made. I think it's often easy to look at Bangladesh, which is quite a poor country. It's not as poor as it was, but it's often too easy to look at the challenges there. But I've also seen a lot of stories of inclusion there, and it's not as systematic. It doesn't have that framework that the US has, and whatever. But I see sort of employers there that are hiring people with disabilities. See groups of people with disabilities that have come out and sort of advocating for their rights. And it really encourages me, because in a lot of other contexts, we're saying, well, when we become like a really developed, really rich country, that we're all sort of in the fifth dimension of technology, then we're going to have these accessibility things. And I'm like, wait a minute, what? Like, you don't need, like, it helps, but there's a lot of inclusion that can happen before you have that money, and before you fixed everything else. And sometimes countries can get a bit distracted by waiting for this kind of perfect future where we're going to be inclusive and respectful of all groups and all individuals, but just not right now. So I think that's the kind of that's the inspiration I took from Bangladesh. On the ILO work, I'm sort of external consultant for them, so I'm sort of sharing from my side. But I think you've spoken to Stefan, Jürgen, they're the people that can give the official view. So I'll give sort of my taste on it. I really like supporting them in this work they're doing with the Global Business and Disability Network for a few reasons. They're working with multinational enterprises and other organizations to make an international platform. Part of this, like a key part of it, and the key part of it for me, is looking at the business case of disability. Yeah, what reasons are going to attract businesses to engage people with disabilities or work on disability? And this is something quite interesting, because some of your viewers might rightly be saying, like, well, hang on a minute, I thought we were talking about rights. And we are talking about rights. And this is kind of a bit like, and this is my personal take on it, but this is a bit of a tightrope that we have to work, that to achieve rights of people with disabilities, we have to engage such a wide range of stakeholders. Right. Each stakeholder has quite a different motivation. And so what the business case refers to for me is like, what are the motivations of businesses and how do we appeal to them so that people with disabilities can get employed and have services and products and whatnot that respond to their needs. And that's it's a delicate line, and I think a lot of people rightly criticize sort of when this is taken too far, that some countries are going on about disability employment, the employment for disabled people, because they don't want to sort of like, this is just a big headache to them, and we just much rather they just like, we got rid of them, and we don't want to sort of providing services or access, but whatever, like get a job, you're so lazy already. And we definitely don't want that, and that's where it's taken too far. And I think disability groups sort of really rightly sort of point out the flaws in that, and that we're not just sort of products of capitalism. So like I said, that's that kind of delicate line of the business case. I think one thing that I've liked about my work with them, which has been more about engaging some of the non-company members in the network. It's been more about sort of organizations working on disability and employment, some of the big sort of charities and NGOs, and other specialists in the disability field, and kind of working with them to sort of see like why this is relevant to them. And I think it's something from the disability sector, it's something that's hard for us, right? Because we're used to activism, we're used to sort of banging on doors, having a good shout about it, and sort of like claiming some rights, and we have like claimed the hell out of some of those rights. And so, like I said, the sort of current current people doing that and previous generations doing that have changed the world and meant that the experience of being a disabled person around the world now is totally different from what it was 50 years ago, or even maybe 20 or 30.
Right.
But like, to get the message further out, we need to work in different ways. We need that different set of skills and how to reach companies and how to engage them. And just to sort of like add one sort of specific thing that I've been working on with them is looking at the idea of national business and disability networks. And I know I had some previous people on the show. I think you had Susan Scott Parker recently, who
Yes.
I think it was probably the first national business and disability network. It probably wasn't called that. It's now Business and Disability Forum in the UK. She brought companies together to look at this in the context of a country. And so one of the pieces that I'm supporting the ILO with is looking at how we can promote those in further countries and how companies coming together can really like solve a shared problem, and they can learn from each other, and that can be a kind of mechanism for collaboration. Which sort of, thanks for mentioning also this group of consultants that we have together with Nick Corby. I sort of co-facilitate a group of consultants working internationally in development and humanitarian issues. Like it's a mailing list and we have calls. But I think a colleague put it really well. He said, well, on disability, like we have issues about knowledge sharing and issues about advocacy. And this group is just one of the small ways, I think, kind of these kind of calls you do and the ways you share information and you get issues and kind of speakers out there is another one. That this kind of journey on disability issues that we're talking about needs kind of, we need a bit more knowledge. We need to kind of see, there's an example of someone like me doing that. Oh, wait a minute, bring it on. I can do that as well, right? Oh, there's like this thing that you can use to solve this problem. And these are like really, really, like it's something I like doing. I sort of see what I want to be doing as connecting and communicating. And this is like one of the things that work on disability, like other social subjects, really needs. I don't know if you've seen on Facebook, there's a group called Accessible Travel Club.
I haven't seen that. I'll have to.
It's really worth looking up. I think it's a community of several thousand people now. It was initially started by a Comable, which is now Srin. I don't remember his surname. He's now joined Airbnb and he's supporting them with access.
Oh, yeah. I've heard about him. Yeah.
And he kind of started a Facebook group, and now there's like thousands of disabled people that love traveling, and we're all in the same group. And like you see the best questions, they're like, if I go to Heathrow, am I going to have a problem with access? And like people say, well, yes and no, look out for this thing. I want to travel for the first time. How should I do it? I'm backpacking in my wheelchair. You're what? This is what it looks like. And then like, I saw the best comment. Someone was backpacking in their wheelchair and they had to take sort of catheters for hygiene issues. And someone said, well, when you've used your catheters towards the end of the trip, you're going to have more room for souvenirs and wine, aren't you? And I love, and this is part of the way disability is changing, and we're changing things on disability, these abilities to connect and share experiences with each other.
And help each other. I mean, I'm definitely going to join that group. And I find that people are so willing to share and join and collaborate. I think, I know that something important is happening, and I also know we went long, but you have such an amazing career in all the work that you're doing, the leadership that you're showing. Sorry, I'm embarrassing you again, but Peter, tell the audience how they can find out more about your work. Thank you,
Debra. Thanks for having me on. I'm not so online. I'm on Twitter at Desibility. That's DESI Ability. If you search for Peter Fremlin or Peter Torres Fremlin, you'll find a little site that says about me. And please, I really welcome people to get in contact. I'm always happy to talk further about these issues and Thanks again, Deborah, for having me on.
Yes, and thank you to you and Nick for putting that consulting group together, because we all, there's not enough people right now in this field, the disability inclusion field, to handle everything that needs to be done. So we need more people joining us, people with disabilities and people without disabilities. It's important that people without disabilities are allies to people with disabilities. That's the way we change the world. But I just appreciate your leadership and the work you're doing, and I just wanted the audience to know about you, Peter. So thank you so much for being on the show today. And I look forward to continue to saving the world with you in the future.
Thanks so much, Deborah, for your encouragement and colleagueship and friendship. I really appreciate it.
Yes, I agree. Okay, bye, everyone.
Okay.